everyone, I'm back again with another McFarlane Toys review, and apologies, but I think there will be a flurry of these over the next few weeks as I catch up to a lot of the McFarlane Toys that I've not had a chance to review yet. But this time, I'm going to be looking at the DC Universe Mr. Freeze figure. Now, I was really pleased to see this figure being announced. I'm a huge fan of Mr. Freeze. I've loved the character ever since I first saw Batman the Animated Series many years ago, and I've always had a soft spot for this particular character, especially growing up and getting familiar with the comic books and looking into his very rich history. And of course, like most long-standing characters who've had such a rich history, they've had many different looks across the years. Now, I've got to be entirely honest with you, I'm not actually that familiar with this particular version or this costume of the character. It looks kind of generic to me. I'm not sure whether this is the most recent up-to-date version of the costume, but for me, it's definitely recognisable as Mr. Freeze. I think this is a really nice looking costume all in all, but I'm certainly more than pleased to see this character in the 7-inch scale. So let's take a look at this packaging. Well, for anyone who's collected any of these DC Multiverse figures will be very familiar with this packaging. I've often criticised them for not being particularly imaginative, but the one thing you can say is they are at least consistent. Most of it, of course, is window display. Behind the character, behind the actual figure itself, we can see this sort of blue collage, which I think works really well. It helps this particular figure jump out of the packaging because that contrast between the blue and the white is actually quite striking. The rest of it is pretty much just black borders and the big DC logo, which I tend to think is a little bland, to be honest, but what the hey. If we flip it to look at the side panel, it is basically just the name in bold. Not an awful lot else to comment on this, really, other than to say that I think it's a tremendous waste of space, which is a real shame, because these are quite chunky side panels, which would look fantastic with artwork on them. Anyway, if we look at the back of the packaging, this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. This looks fantastic. Now, interestingly, this image here, which is also reflected in the trading card that the figure comes with, is taken from the New 52. So I'm actually relatively up to date with this version of the character. It's actually not my favourite look for this character, but interesting because that is not the figure that we're getting in the packaging. So I'm not quite sure why they've drawn that parallel. It's a little bit confusing, to be honest, but it's still very nice artwork. Now, I have to say straight off the bat, there's something quite delightful about this figure. I think I actually really love this costume. It's not the most colourful, but I love all the elements to it. The sculpting all around is pretty fantastic. I really like this head sculpt. I think this is a pretty decent likeness of Mr. Freeze or Victor Freeze. There's not really an awful lot to that character in terms of his look, but I think he does look fantastic here. I really like these goggles. I particularly love the dome. For some reason, I really love domes on my characters, particularly my toys. You give me Mysterio, Mr. Freeze any day of the week, and there's just something really exciting about this for some reason. I don't know why, but I think they've done a tremendous job of this. This looks really good. All the proportions look correct, and I love these big silver tubes that are coming out of his chest and into his back there. I think this looks fantastic. The paint apps are really nice where they are, nice and vivid colours, and very striking all in all. Now, again, as you can see here, clearly this is not the Mr. Freeze that they reference in terms of the trading card or the image on the back of the packaging. I'm not sure why they've gone with this version of Mr. Freeze, because clearly this is a very different version of the character. But again, in terms of the sculpting, the rest of the body looks fantastic. I think all these proportions look really nice and chunky and in perfect proportion with himself. And I love these armor pieces. I think it looks great. There's actually a lot of detail in here, lots of little individual buttons and grooves and things which look really, really cool. If I had a criticism, it would be that maybe they haven't capitalized on this in terms of the paint apps. It would have been nice to see a little bit more color, maybe some paint washes running through this to really draw these details out. It does look a little bit bland, I suppose, but hey, I'm not familiar with the version of this character, as I said at the start of the video, so maybe this is comic book accurate. But all in all, this still looks really cool. I think this is a great looking visual for this character and works really well. Likewise, if we look at the back of the figure and we see that tank there, this is really nicely sculpted. We can actually see some individual dents into that oxygen tank, which looks really cool. And the grey silver paint that they've opted for here is very nice. It catches the light very nicely and it looks really striking against the bluey tones of that white costume. Now, this figure does come with just the one pair of hands, which is kind of unusual these days, but it does seem to be something that McFarlane Toys doesn't really do an awful lot of at the moment. So he does have this one pair of hands, and they're both sort of gripping hands. One in particular has a trigger finger, which is obviously going to be used for his ice weapon, but other than that, these are the hands that he's stuck with. I think these work pretty well. Maybe it would have been nice to have a closed fist for one of these hands, but yeah, I think this is quite effective for what we need him to do when it comes to holding his weapon, so I'm happy to forego that. In terms of the boots, these are very nicely sculpted. I'm not sure whether any of these pieces have been recycled on any of the other DC Multiverse figures, so I'm not really qualified to say, but I think these work really well for this particular character and they look great. In terms of articulation, yes, the dome does pop off, so you can move the ball joint in the neck of this figure and pose the head however you want it. So of course he'll look from side to side, he'll lean left and right, and he will even look up and down as well. So I couldn't really ask for more from this. In terms of his shoulders, he's got articulation here in the ball joint, and there's actually a bit of a butterfly clip here as well that allows that arm to pop out a little bit. Thankfully, the armor piece is a separate piece there and is made of a sort of rubber, which is pretty flexible and will work with the articulation, which is really nice to see. So that arm will kick up and out. There is, of course, also a double joint at the elbow there, so those arms can fold all the way back there and just about touch his head, which is great. Now, there is a traditional pin swivel at the wrist, a ball joint there, that will allow that hand to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. There is a ball joint in the chest as well, which is great, so he can move from side to side, he can lean left and right, and he can even bend forwards and backwards, and there's a pretty good range of motion here, so I'm very, very happy with this joint. There's ball joints in the hips, and this is nicely disguised by the fantastic rubber belt piece around his crotch, which is really, really good at hiding this joint, and it works nicely in terms with the articulation. There's also a straight swivel at the top of the boot cut there as well. The legs will also kick forwards, backwards, there's a double joint at the knee, and there is a ball joint at the ankle that will allow the foot to hinge forwards and backwards and lean left and right. Now, as I mentioned, McFarlane Toys are pretty light when it comes to accessories, it seems. He does thankfully come with his freeze gun though, which looks pretty cool. I really like the look of this. You can actually see the freeze effect coming out of the barrel there, which is a nice touch. This is nicely painted and nicely sculpted. I think this works a treat. Just a shame that we don't really get anything else, but I think what we have here works perfectly well with this character. And as we can see, he has no issues holding this freeze blaster, which is great. It is a little bit tricky to get it into his trigger hand though, I have to say. I'm not entirely satisfied that his trigger finger really goes onto the trigger with this. It's not an easy fit at first, but once it's in his grasp, he certainly can grasp the barrel with his other hand, and I have to say this looks really good. It's a nice firm grip, and it looks pretty effective actually for putting him in different poses, which is great. Okay, so in terms of a scale comparison, here he is next to another DC Multiverse Batman. This is the Batman from the Batman Hush 2-pack that was recently released. So you can see these scale quite nicely. I'm a little bit unsure of the proportions of Batman, to be honest. I'm more unhappy there. Batman looks a little bit too big, a little bit too beefy here. He looks taller than Mr. Freeze, and in my head, Mr. Freeze should always be a little bit taller, a little bit bigger than Batman to be a bit more imposing. Of course, he's got all that armor and he's got the dome, so he should kind of be a bit taller than Batman. So I actually think he scales much nicer against the Greg Capullo DC Collectibles Batman. This scaling here looks really good to me. This looks much more what I'd expect from this pairing. And since I mentioned that series, let's have a look at the DC Collectibles Mr. Freeze from the Greg Capullo line, and you can see the difference between these two characters. Interestingly, of course, this version of Mr. Freeze is the one that we see on the packaging for our, our DC Multiverse Mr. Freeze. You can see there's a strong contrast between these two looks, but I have to say, I much prefer this version that we have from DC Multiverse than the Greg Capullo version. So, in terms of a star rating, I'm going to give him 4 stars. I'm really very, very pleased with this figure. I think overall his look is really good. I really like his proportions. I like his articulation. I like his ray gun accessory. And I like what they've done with the dome. I think all in all, this is a very pleasing figure. I think he strikes a really imposing, impressive visual when he's on display. And I think he's just a really nice version of this particular character. Even though I'm not familiar with his costume, I really like it. I think it works a treat. So I'm very happy with this figure all in all. Obviously, I've given 4 stars and not 5, so what's holding him back? Well, part of that would be accessories. I do feel like we need to have something a little bit more. Maybe just an extra pair of hands would be quite cool. That's pretty standard these days, so a shame that it's not included here. I might also suggest that it would have been nice to have seen a few more paint apps. I think the sculpting's great, but I feel like they could have had a little bit more of a wash running through this particular figure to bring out some of the details that we see in the armor. That would have been really nice. And then finally, I just just feel like the scaling is ever so slightly off against their 7-inch Batman. I feel like he just needed to be a little bit bigger. But other than that, this is a really nice figure, and I'm sure if you're a fan, you'll really like this one. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.